Hi, you're watching Cooking with Diane. I'm Diane, and today we're going to be making one of my favorite dinners, black bean soup. Bean and vegetable soup is super versatile. It's a really great pantry dinner. It's a great way to use up those extra vegetables in your fridge at the end of the week. And it's also really economical. Dried beans plus vegetables make a lot of food with not a lot of ingredients. I'm going to be using black beans and certain vegetables and spices today, but you can switch up the beans, the vegetables, the spices. You can really put your own twist on this and you won't mess it up. With any kind of bean soup, I always start with dried beans, and I like to start by soaking the beans. Soaking your beans before you cook them has a lot of benefits. First, it will reduce the cooking time. Beans take a long time to cook because they have to completely rehydrate from being super dried up. And soaking them in advance of cooking can reduce that cooking time by sometimes up to an hour. Second, soaking beans releases something called their phytates, which is a compound found in beans and nuts that's hard for us to digest and is one reason that beans give us gas. So by soaking them in advance, we're making them more digestible. And three, soaking beans removes any dust or dirt that might be clinging to the outside of the beans. So it really gives them a good clean. So to get started, we're actually going to go back in time to this morning when I soaked the beans.
So I'm just using regular dried beans from the grocery store. This is a 16-ounce package, which is about 2 cups of dried beans. I cover them with tap water by a couple of inches. You're going to want to use more water than you think you need because the beans expand while they soak. You don't need to refrigerate them, just leave them open on the counter for ideally up to 8 hours.
Now my beans have been soaking for a little over 8 hours. Now because of all those phytates and dirt that have leached into the soaking water, I'm actually going to drain the beans and discard the soaking water and cook the beans in fresh water. I'm going to put them into a nice big pot and cover them with water. The beans are still going to absorb water and grow while they're cooking, so you want to cover them with about 1 inch of water. But beyond that, it just depends on whether you like your soup to be thicker or more liquidy. I like a thicker black bean soup, so I usually just cover them with 1 inch of water and make sure that the water doesn't go below the surface of the beans at any point during cooking. If I wanted a soupier soup, I would add more water, maybe 2 or 3 inches above the beans. I'm also going to take one last look for any rocks or twigs or weird looking beans while I can. And I'm also going to add 1 big pinch of salt right away to the beans. Some people might tell you not to salt beans until after they're done cooking, but I disagree with that. These beans are going to go on my stove on high until the water comes up to a boil, at which point I'm going to lower it to a simmer. How long to cook the beans really depends on a lot of things. Older beans take longer to cook. Some types of beans take longer to cook. It also depends on how long you soaked your beans for. But in general, beans will take from 45 minutes to 2 hours to cook. So I always start my beans before I set up the rest of my soup to give them a head start on cooking, because that's the thing that's going to take the longest. I also always like to start my bean soup at least 2 hours before I want to eat, so I make sure that I give my beans enough time to cook and I'm not waiting around at 10 o'clock at night waiting for my beans to finish cooking. While my beans are cooking, I can get started on the vegetable part of my soup. So I wrestled up all the vegetables in my pantry and fridge that I thought would taste good in black bean soup. Always a good go-to in any kind of soup is onion, carrot, and celery. And you don't really need a lot of any one vegetable. You can see I only have 2 celery ribs here, a couple small carrots, 1 small to medium-sized onion. I love peppers in black bean soup, so I'm going to add a green pepper. If you have red peppers or jalapeno peppers or poblano peppers, those would be great too. I'm going to add some garlic. You could add more than 2 cloves, absolutely. And towards the end of cooking, I have some tomatoes that I can add. Other vegetables that might be good in this soup would be mushrooms, zucchini, any other type of pepper, okra, maybe even some squash or sweet potato to add some sweetness to it. So I encourage you to really use what you have in your kitchen and what you like, and not just go by what I'm doing. One last ingredient that I like to put in my black bean soup is bacon. I only add half a package, so that's 4 ounces for what's going to be a really big pot of soup. I find that even a little bit adds a lot of flavor and makes my husband more likely to eat a dinner that is otherwise just beans and vegetables. If you don't want to add bacon, you can totally leave it out. You could even substitute vegetarian bacon like tempeh bacon, or you could add a little bit of smoked paprika to give your soup that kind of smoky taste. So I'm going to cut up all of these vegetables, and when I make bean soup, I like to cut my vegetables to be about the same size as the beans. So I think about what size the black beans are, and I try to make my vegetables about that size. To me, that's a 1/2 inch dice. If this is a section that you have a lot of trouble with, check out my knife skills page and you can see how to specifically chop a lot of different types of vegetables and even how to hold your knife. So now I've prepped all of my vegetables for the soup. So let's go over to the stove and we'll get cooking. So here we are over at my stovetop. I have my cast iron pan heating over medium heat to cook my vegetables. And you can see on one of my back burners here, I have my black beans simmering. The reason you don't want to cook your beans too fast at a boil is that a boil will cause the beans to burst and all of the inside of the beans will just come out into the liquid. So to keep your beans whole and tender, you do want to cook them fairly slowly at a simmer. Into my pan, I'm going to add just a little bit of canola oil, and I'm going to start by cooking my bacon. So I preheated my pan. It's pretty hot right now, but then I turned it down to low. And I want to cook this over medium to low heat for about 10 minutes or until the bacon is rendered out all of its fat and it's nice and brown and crispy, but not black and burnt. If you don't want to use bacon in your soup, you would skip this step. Or if you're using tempeh bacon, you could cook it now to just give it a nice brown in some oil. But you wouldn't need to cook it for 10 minutes because tempeh bacon doesn't have fat to render out. So now the bacon pieces are a lot smaller and browner than they were when we started. So I feel good about taking them out. They've also left a considerable amount of bacon grease in the pan. So I'm going to try to scoop out the bacon pieces, but leave the grease in the pan, and we're going to cook the vegetables in the grease. At this point, your pan can be medium to medium high heat, and we're going to add the vegetables. You want them to sizzle like that, and a big pinch of salt. And the vegetables we're going to cook down for 5 to 10 minutes or until they start to look soft and the onions start to look a little bit more translucent. We don't need to cook them fully here because they're going to cook in the soup too. We're just giving them a head start by bringing out some of their flavor together with the fat. Sauteing the vegetables before we add them to the beans will give the soup a lot more flavor than just adding the raw vegetables to the beans would. So my veggies have cooked for 5 minutes. The onions are looking less bright white and more translucent. So that's a good sign that it's time for me to add my spices. It's that if you're using ground spices in the soup, You'll bring out their flavor best if you add them to your vegetables right after you saute the vegetables rather than directly to the soup. So for this soup, I've decided to use some ground cumin, which I think goes really well with black beans. And with cumin, I like to add ground coriander because I think they like each other a lot. And to complement the smoky bacon flavor, I'm going to add some smoked paprika. This is especially good to add if you're not adding bacon. You could also add plain paprika that's not smoked. That would add a lot of flavor too. And I have some dried oregano leaf that I'm going to use. There's so many other spices that would be good here. Chili powder would be good here. Garlic or onion powder would be good here. Even something like dried thyme might be nice. So feel free to use what you like. I just stir the dried spices right into the vegetables, and they're kind of going to coat the vegetables and get stuck on them. And the hot pan is going to help toast the spices and bring out their flavor. And you'll notice that's happening because you'll be able to smell the spices after a minute or so. This is also a good time to add any soft vegetables that don't need to get pre-cooked, like tomatoes or greens or frozen vegetables. So I'm going to add the tomatoes I chopped up, and I also decided to add some frozen corn. I'm going to add a little more salt to bring out the flavor of the tomatoes. And I'm going to add the bacon back into the pan now too. I'm going to stir it all together and turn off the heat because our pre-cooking is done. So I'm going to move my soup pot to the front. And this is a good time to taste my beans to get a sense of where we are in the cooking process. I think my beans have simmered for about half an hour now. So I'm pretty sure they're not cooked all the way. But I just want to see how cooked are they? Are they a little bit soft, or are they still really rock hard? And the best way to do that is to taste them. They're kind of in between. They're still quite crunchy, but they're definitely getting there. This probably needs another half hour to 45 minutes to cook. While the beans finish cooking, I'm going to add the vegetables to them so all of the flavors can start to meld. So I'm just going to bring my whole pot and dump it in there. And scrape up any of those good spices sticking to the bottom of the pan. And now I'm going to add one more pinch of salt for good measure. I know it seems like a lot of salt, but it's going to be a lot of soup, and it's pretty difficult to over salt this kind of thing. This is also a good time to think about the water level. You do want to make sure that the liquid is covering the beans. So if you see beans poking up above the surface of the liquid, add another inch or so of water. And I'm going to continue simmering this for probably 30 minutes to 45 minutes. I'll taste it now and then to see if the beans are cooked through. And once the beans are cooked through, we'll be done. So now my soup has been simmering for an additional 45 minutes or so, which means that my beans have cooked for at least an hour and a half. Now is the time to see if your beans are completely cooked. So just because it's been cooking for this long doesn't mean my beans are cooked. So it's important to taste a few beans and see if they're completely soft all the way through with no crunchiness to them. And you want to taste more than one bean because the beans aren't always going to necessarily cook evenly. Sometimes some of them get softer and some of them stay hard. So you want to taste a couple beans just to make sure they're all cooked fully. And you also want to taste just the broth to see if it tastes good. The broth is going to carry most of the flavor of the soup. So if your broth seems kind of bland, now's the time to add more salt. You could also add more spices. You could also add some fresh lime or lemon juice to give it a zing. But keep tasting and adding salt, acid, or spices to try to make your soup taste as good as you want it to taste. Once your soup is flavored to your liking, you can either leave it the way it is now in terms of texture. If you want it to be looser, you can add a little bit of water or broth. If you want it to be thicker, you could actually blend part of it. You can use a ladle to transfer some of your soup into a blender, blend it, and then add it back to the soup. Or if you have an immersion blender, you can just blend one corner of the soup and then stir that in. So you can either leave your soup chunky, you could even blend all of it if you like a creamy soup, or you can just blend part of it, which is what I prefer to do. So once you have the texture and flavor of the soup that you like, it's time to plate it. So I finished my soup, and once it's done, it's done. You have your whole meal right there in the pot. I like to plate it with a little bit of sour cream and fresh cilantro. You could also serve it with some fresh lime wedges. You could also put some fresh avocado on top or chopped scallions. The toppings really make the soup, so use what you have and what you like. So just to recap, if you're making any kind of bean soup, the first thing you want to do is start by soaking your beans, ideally 8 hours before they cook, but even 1 hour is going to make a difference. Next, about 2 hours before you want to eat, you're going to drain your beans, put them up in a pot with some fresh water, and start cooking them. You're going to bring them up to a boil, then lower them to a simmer and simmer them for as long as it takes for them to get soft. While your beans are simmering, you chop and saute whatever vegetables you want to put in your soup. And on top of your sauteed vegetables, you'll add your spices to bloom their flavor. Then you put the sauteed vegetables together with the soup, add any softer vegetables like greens, tomatoes, frozen things that didn't get sauteed, and simmer it all together until the flavors are melded and the beans are soft. Finally, you want to taste your soup to make sure the beans are soft and cooked, that it has the flavor that you want it to have, and maybe blend a little bit of the soup if you want that thicker, creamier texture. So thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. I hope you make lots of bean soup in your future, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.